over the last few weeks, we've heard from quite a few people on the programme who, shall we say, are vaccine hesitant or vaccine sceptics. That does not mean that they're anti-vaxxers. They just need to be convinced that it is safe. And I think that's a perfectly legitimate thing to say. If you are nervous that it looks on the surface that this vaccine has been developed in double quick time. Now, it's not quite as simple as that, it has to be said. So I thought, well, let's take some calls on this in this hour. But let's also hear from somebody who can really explain why we ought to have confidence in the vaccine. I was on the Jeremy Vine show earlier with Dr Sarah Jarvis, and she, I thought, gave the best explanation I've heard so far of why we should actually be really positive about this and why we should all take it. You can feel free to disagree with her over the course of the programme, but let's base what we discuss on facts rather than on supposition. Well, Sarah joins me now. Sarah, very good evening to you. It seems as though we spent half the day together today. Do you understand why some people are, shall we say, COVID vaccine sceptics?
Yes, I do, because this has been developed more quickly than most vaccines are. In fact, than almost any vaccine has been. But there are really good reasons for that. And I think what this has arisen from is a fundamental misunderstanding of why it takes so long to get vaccines out. And it's been developed. I mean, some people say, well, it's only been developed since sort of February, March time. But actually work on these vaccines has been going on for a long time before that, hasn't it? And one of the reasons we heard earlier in the news hour from someone who was saying, well, that part of the reason it's been done quickly is because there's been no funding issues. We've had money thrown at it in a way that would not be normal in the normal development pattern for a vaccine. Absolutely. So those are two of the big reasons. So the first one, if you go right back to the beginning, is you need to have the genetic blueprint of the vaccine, of the virus rather. And we got that back in January, and it was made available to the entire scientific world. So basically, that's tick several months off the list. Then there's looking for funding, as you so rightly say, and often that can really take a long time because with most of the other vaccines that we've been looking at, there are outbreaks. So for instance, with SARS, there was an outbreak. There was quite a lot of cases in South Asia, in the Far East rather, and then of course it sort of fizzled out and went away. The same thing happened with MERS. With Ebola, we had some very severe outbreaks, but they tended to be fairly short-lived. They were on the whole, very carefully contained because this was such an unbelievably deadly virus with a hugely high death rate. And while there has been one recent outbreak, on the whole, the outbreaks fizzled out fairly quickly. And that made it more difficult to get funding.
Now, the word that you often see on social media related to vaccines is thalidomide. And obviously, this was going back to, the 1960s, I think, wasn't it? Now, when people say, oh, yes, but what about thalidomide? Again, is that a valid argument in any way, shape or form?
Well, apart from anything else, thalidomide was not a vaccine. It was a drug, and it was used on pregnant women. And we know that pregnant women are a very, very different case. Interestingly, this vaccine is not going to be rolled out to pregnant women. There is currently no plan to roll it out. If it happens, it will only happen after further studies have taken place. And on the whole, pregnant women are not a high-risk group in terms of dying from COVID by any means. And therefore, it's entirely possible that it won't be rolled out on them at all. But no, they are the one group where there really is a big difference, because if you think about it, we give drugs very differently to children because we know they react differently than to adults. If you give them to a pregnant woman, then you may be giving them to a baby whose spinal cord is developing, whose limbs are developing, whose heart is developing, whose brain is developing at an unbelievably rapid rate. So things are changing very, very much more quickly, and pregnant women are treated in a very different way. Unfortunately, that has resulted in many of the treatments that we have for women being very, very old-fashioned, actually, because essentially the vast majority of medical research into pregnant women stopped with thalidomide. But with other areas, it's gone on. And certainly where this vaccine is concerned, mRNA vaccines have not just been looked at very extensively and researched extensively for other viruses. We've also been using them for cancers, and that's one of the main areas they've been used with enormous success to produce sort of personalised treatment, particularly for people with melanoma. We had a question in the last hour from Erin, who described herself as a genetic engineer. And she asked a question which I don't think any of our panel really could answer, about the Irish government, and I think the UK government as well, has given some of the drug companies immunity from prosecution if something did go wrong. Can you shed any light on that?
Yes, I can. So it's a fairly standard procedure when something is given emergency funding. This happened previously. There was a problem with a vaccine called Pandemrix, which was developed for the swine flu pandemic, the concerns about the pandemic, and it didn't go through any of the same testing. So when the government gives emergency legislation, then they do provide immunity to the company. But that does not mean that the trials have not gone on. What we do know is that it is possible that somewhere down the line, 1 in 10 million people might develop a very, very severe side effect as a result of this vaccine. But this is a virus which has killed at least 60,000 people in the UK so far. So what we need to be careful of is to realise that there is a fundamental difference between something being safe in terms of population and safe in terms of individuals. So, for instance, with chemotherapy, many of these drugs have very nasty side effects, but what they're fighting is much worse. Whereas here, we're giving it to people who, on the whole, are currently very healthy, but who are at high risk of having the vaccine. So what that means is that if you get a 1 in a million side effect, but that side effect is devastating for you, then it doesn't affect you 1/1,000,000% or 100,000th of a percent. It affects you 100%. And that's why the government has provided a vaccine damage register, which will allow people to get recompense if this does happen. But basically, if you're going to ask a company to produce a vaccine at this sort of speed, even if the side effects are 1 in a million, and it has now been tested on 43,500 people without any severe adverse effects, then frankly, it just wouldn't be realistic. And it wouldn't be realistic in any medicine, quite frankly. We would probably still be living in the world of leeches.
Now, I can't think of a single scientist, a single medical professional who has said that they would not take the vaccine. Now, to me, that says an awful lot, because, I mean, you are not going to have sort of tribal groupthink, I don't think, among scientists and medical people. But everyone seems to think this is a really positive development, and they will all take it. So why is it that there is still a significant part of the population, according to YouGov today, 1 in 5 of us are reluctant to take the vaccine, even though everyone in the field seems to think that it's something we all ought to do?
I genuinely wish I knew. I think this all started with Wakefield, and I'm afraid social media has provided an enormous bubble. What we've seen in the research is that the more of your time you spend and the more of your news you get from social media, the less likely you are to say yes to the vaccine. And some of the social media videos that I've been sent around are absolutely terrifying. I got one on Twitter the other day, somebody saying, oh, a great friend of mine who was a nurse but who's now a surgeon has told me, I can't stand this anymore, Laura. I'm going to have to come out and say I was called to a secret meeting at my hospital, and they've told us that they're going to tell the public that we've all been vaccinated when in fact we haven't. And the reason they're going to tell them that is because if we haven't been vaccinated, we can't have any side effects. But if they tell them we've been vaccinated, then they'll think it's safe. Well, I mean, it was just so, isn't it funny how it's always a friend of a friend? It is absolutely terrifying how these things spread. But I was sent this from somebody who genuinely believed it to be true.
Well, there's no accounting for folk, is there? I suppose that's the lesson that we can all learn from it. But just finally, Jonathan Van Tam said at the Downing Street press conference earlier that he thought that coronavirus would be with us forever. Boris Johnson looked visibly shocked by this and kind of railed against it a bit. Was he wise to say that?
I think he was probably realistic to say that. I think there's a very good chance.
He slightly rode back from it a bit after he saw Boris was rather shocked by this. But
I think the likelihood is it'll probably become epidemic rather than pandemic. We will get more people who will develop immunity to it, and we don't know, of course, at the moment how long that immunity will last. That is one of the big concerns. But I certainly do not think, especially with the vaccine, that we're going to see it at the sort of pandemic level. Pandemics happen because pretty much nobody is immune and everybody is vulnerable. That's what we saw with every flu pandemic that we've had, because the flu virus was different enough. When we get what's called shift and drift in the virus for flu, and what happens is that every year it drifts a little bit. It's a little bit different than it was last year. And what that means is that some people are immune, but some people are susceptible. When you get a major change, it means that having had it before does not confer immunity. And that's what we've seen with pandemics for flu. That's what we've seen with coronavirus. Nobody has seen this form before. And there is little or nothing to suggest that having had one of the other coronaviruses, and there are 7 which can infect humans, of which 3 cause the common cold, basically, having had those does not appear to confer immunity.
Well, Sarah, you started the day at 9 o'clock with Jeremy Vine. You're finishing it at roughly 9 o'clock with me. You're not in Wales, so you can go and have a nice, well-deserved drink now, I think. Thank you very much for joining us. That's Dr Sarah Jarvis, GP and Clinical Director of PatientAccess.com.